Hello, and welcome to another episode of Just Keep Writing.
A podcast for writers.
By writers.
To keep you writing.
I'm Nick.
I'm Shingai.
I'm Sameem.
I'm Gabe.
I'm LP.
And I'm Will.
And leading our discussion today is going back to Gabe, following up from our episode last week. Gabe, tell us, what are we talking about today?
Awesome. So this part is like literally my favorite part about writing, which is characters. Oh yeah, so I'm so excited to have this conversation. And this part in the book starts. I will start off this by saying that I wish it was longer in the book. It was deeper in the book, but I think we can make that work. So the first part is. The title of this is Creating Generative Characters. As he said before with titles, now he's going into the names and characters in general. So the first part is names and physical traits.
Before we start, could we just mention what was the book's name and who is it by? Just in case it's someone's first episode.
Oh yeah, it's the book Refused to be Done by Matt Bell.
What page are we on?
This part is in page 31. Yeah. So the first part is how do you work character names and their physical traits? So in the book, Matt makes the point about names and how like a good name can be as generative as a good title. And how like at first a name might not click for a character, but as you go through the story, as you use it more and more, it becomes something that you're used to and that it becomes one of the most used words in your story. So the main point of this is that some writers think of their naming just like as a piece of literature, of a sound that you will be using often in your writing. But also another point about the name, about naming characters is the baggage those names have. I guess this is more true in real world stories because names give you culture, give you also relationships and places in society, etc. So, I'll just start off this about how do you guys go about naming your characters and at which point do you name your characters, which is like the main point that Matt goes in this section. So, LP, how do you go about this?
I am actively running through every childhood friend and family member that I have. And I ascribe just a couple of tidbits from the people that I care about to the characters. As far as main characters go, like I make up a lot of names too, but like all my main name characters, I'm probably related to them.
And at what point in your stories do you tend to name your characters? Like when do your characters go from being named MC or quote unquote to having the name?
For me, it happens like after I figure out. Well, first thing that usually comes for me is the concept, and then the next thing is like, what's the situation that the people are in? Like, what's the novum? Okay, now what's the situation that people are in? And then as I start to like figure out what the character's story, that's what I think like what the character is, what they're doing. I was like, Yanis. Ooh, that's Kenyatta. Okay. And then I just kind of go from there and let what I know about these people in my actual life speak a little bit on what the character ends up being. But yeah.
Mm-hmm. So Nick, how do you do this?
I feel like I might be the weird one in this scenario, but I start with characters. I don't write anything until I know my character. So like, I think understanding like kind of the general plot line and like kind of the general world building, I know my characters way more before I know any of that. And that's, I don't know why. I've got to have a good name. I use names for cultural reference a lot to kind of help paint the story and paint the picture and things like that for me. But yeah, I start with the character name. I start with, well, now he's named this or she's named that. Like, what are some characters and traits? Like, and like LP said, like I've used people in my past to kind of do this and bring people to life. The Tuckerism is, I think, is what it's called. And that's always fun too. But I can't start a story without knowing who it's about. I don't know, like, how can I write something unless I know how someone's moving through that world first? Mm-hmm. And what are their tendencies? What are their habits? What are their tics? What's the positive and negatives of that person and things like that?
Mhm. So, Shingai, how do you name your characters?
Wow, it's like you saw me before I knew that I had something to say. I kind of similar to Nick feel like my characters sometimes need to be formed before I know what their names are. So I have placeholder names. Like I usually will use a random thing. But that's not always the case. Sometimes I know exactly what a character's name is going to be from the beginning. And then the other thing that I'm thinking about when I'm writing characters is because like I'm mostly writing characters from my cultural background, and names have very specific significance because of like what they mean, who you're named after, and it also implies what tribe you're from if you have like a tribal name. And for me, I like to use Swahili names because they feel more neutral, but like still specific to East Africa. Yeah, but I did have a character in my novel. I thought this was kind of funny because it's historical fantasy, and there was the husband of a queen that I'm writing about, and I called him Simjui, which means I don't know him. And this was kind of like my little sass salt because historically we learn a lot about, like, we hear the names of like men who existed who fought revolutionary wars, but women are like left out of that history, or femme people. And so for me it was like, yeah, I'm being very specific about naming the femme people, and like your name is in this moment a little bit of an afterthought to me. It was petty, but it was what I needed.
So really we're talking about characters, their names right away, right?
Yeah.
Like when do we name them? I always just, I don't know, they just come to me. There are times though, the name that I've started with, as the story evolves, my character likes to tell me that's not my name. Stop calling me that bitch. And then I have to like change it, because it's just like, okay, the energy behind this character, it's not working. So I think there's been a couple stories that I've changed the name of the character as I started researching the meaning of names. So like I had a character in a short story I wrote called Soul Collector.
Which is amazing, by the way.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. That I needed to change it after I was doing some research in the names, because energetically it fit into the story and it fit that character more so than the name I gave them. So I think it's like each time it's a little bit different. There's been total times in Renegada, this sci-fi space opera heist I'm writing, none of the characters' names have changed, because all of them are like the essence of those characters, and none of their names are changing. Like that is just who they are. And that's partly, it's like, you know I don't want to get too like woo woo, but with that story specifically, all of those characters talk to me in a certain way. And like that's probably one of the few stories where I really feel like my characters are controlling the story more than me. I feel more like a vessel for them. Oddly enough, I have a webcomic called Vessel. Check it out in the show notes. Anyway.
Nice segue.
Thank you. Sameem?
I think the question was, how do we name our characters? Is that right?
Yeah, and like at which point in your story?
Okay.
In developing the story, yeah.
I think I had a tendency in the past to figure out some really deep meaning behind a name. So I'd spend hours searching for a name that like had a lot to do with the plot, and would have some really deep underlying meaning that only a reader who was going to go the extra mile to like analyze and uncover things about the story would know. And then I just would never write the story. So I now stop myself from doing that. I might come back at a later stage of the story and sort of think back and find a name that does fit and work for that. But I think more often than not, I just cycle through things, drop a name in. I think I sometimes will use a name to, like Shingai was saying, like signify the person's sort of cultural heritage or more specific things about their ethnicity. But I also sometimes use it to signify, I think, something unusual about their background that isn't what you think it would be. So sort of like giving a person sort of like a mixed first and last name that is coming from two different groups, that's sort of signifying something about their past. And there's usually a backstory there. So I think there are I have a lot of fun naming and like finding naming conventions and whatnot. But in the recent year, I've stopped myself from indulging in that just so I can focus on the story first.
Also, shout out to Sameem for finishing the first draft of his novel.
So thank you.
Oh my God, yeah. Yeah, so
yeah,
I mean,
that's so exciting. Sorry, didn't mean to interrupt, Gabe, but I wanted to be like, woo! Yeah, that's great. Yeah, got it. Yeah.
Thanks,
Get
everyone.
some drinks, or if we don't drink, get some coffee. If we don't drink coffee, go celebrate whatever way that you celebrate.
Take your
Ice
pick.
cream.
Ice cream.
I just had some mochi ice cream, so I'm covering all the
Yep.
bases. Don't worry.
I love it. Bring it on. I was going to say something else, but I was like, that's inappropriate. Okay, go ahead.
So, I mean, I'm wondering about like the differences. Obviously, there are differences in naming in real world and fantasy worlds. I mean, one of the things that I do for fantasy naming is like pick a part in Google Maps, go for in a place in the world, look at the naming, like the names around the place, and then like play with that to get the gist of the etymology of a place or things like that, and then like move it to not even a similar culture in a fantasy world, just like the energy the names are giving. Because as I said before, I think, I mean, for me, and Shingai mentioned it too, like names give so much culture. Like there's so much that you can communicate just with a name, and even in a fantasy setting. So I mean, and also as Sameem said, like I can just go spend hours just picking names, having a bag of names. Like I have an Excel sheet with a list of names with every letter, which, I mean, there's also this thing of not naming, just a technique of not naming characters starting with the same letter or having the same sounds, like to not confuse readers. That in general, you can do whatever you want, of course. But LP?
Yeah, I think that sometimes with secondary worlds, it can get a little tricky because I remember reading Gideon the Ninth and thinking about how the naming conventions were very Latin based, and how apparently the author intended to encode people of color, but never just kind of said black or brown, in a way that was clear, right? And like, and I get that in some ways that can be nebulous in that, like, brown person in this space could be from Mexico. This brown person in this space could be from Pakistan. Brown person in this space could be from Cambodia, right? But like, it just bothered me because once we got into this sci fantasy spacefaring thing, we were still using Latin derivations for numbers, right? And those are how we named people. And so I think there's a level of of indigeneity that we could always kind of try to incorporate that honestly I think kind of falls by the wayside. And I think part of that has to do with like the contract of whiteness, that like thinking that this is by default, or that like these are things that we can give away or give or take in any culture, but that's not true for when things get a little blacker or browner, right? So like, were I to see like a Mexican fantasy with like Incan or Mayan derivations, I was like, oh, that's more interesting to me than like, seeing takes on Samuel. I was like, Samuel. Oh, it's Samuel with the W instead of a U. You just did something magical there. I'm so proud of you.
Yeah.
So I think in secondary worlds, there are opportunities. I think that I personally think that I would go harder in secondary worlds than I necessarily would in primary world. Is that a thing? primary world, whatever. Fuck it. Yeah.
Okay, yeah, it works. So Shingai.
Obviously, LP had a lot of interesting points because everyone's hand is up right now. I think for me, I just wanted to emphasize the fact that naming is political, which is kind of what LP was getting at a little, and something that even by calling naming cultural, we're also getting at. I think even just thinking about Ursula K. Le Guin's Earthsea trilogy, and just how intentional the idea of naming is in those books. I think anyone thinking about naming in storytelling should like touch that trilogy because it's just so beautifully written. Also because it's Ursula K. Le Guin. But also thinking about dead naming, thinking about like what it means to choose your name, what it means to have a name that is like in Kikuyu culture, you're named after your grandmother because the idea is that your grandmother's spirit lives on through you. So what does it mean to be named for someone else who has passed, who has become an ancestor? There's just like so many different details and things about naming that are so important to think about, especially when you're writing diverse characters into the story.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, like what you said about, I mean, having the name of your grandmother. There's here in Mexico, I don't know if in many other places, it is so common, at least in the previous generation, of having the name of your father or your mother, and then having 7 people. Like my nephew is Daniel the Fourth, and definitely it's gonna be a 5th and 6th, and I mean that's also a thing. Will's just waving, but let's go with Nick.
Wait your turn, Will. Wait your turn. So I want to bring to a point that LP brought up about naming conventions and how some people will give names, but they're not giving cultural references to the names. And it's kind of what I'm trying to get at here is intentionality. And I think that will stop. I'm going to punch you later. Intentionality, right? So if you are going to have a Hispanic character, tell the audience they are Hispanic. Don't just give vague descriptions in naming conventions where people are guessing at it. Because as LP said, having someone who is a brown character could mean a plethora of different cultures. And so you have to be intentional on this. And I'm going to harp on this more specifically. Like I see this more from white writers because we've never had to do this before. In our own writing, we can just say someone is white, and there's also the white default. So intentionality has to go in behind this, that if you are going to have a character of color and they're coming from a very specific cultural background, you have to say it. Or you have to give enough context and clues that there's no guessing behind it or what ifs or confusion on that one. Will?
Thank you so much, Nick. To LP, do you want to say something? Because your lips are moving.
I'm practicing my Megan Trainor. My lips are moving, but something. Anyway, I just want to jump on to what Nick said. And like, I think there's a very weird, I've been watching a lot of like old TV from other places, and this idea of like lack of conflict and like, hey, just be really esoteric about it. But there's actually nothing fucking wrong with saying my character, I am of Peruvian descent. I am Kikuyu. I am from the South in America and I am Black. And like whether, because we can, one of my initial problems with Gideon the Ninth, and I've been corrected, is that, you know, the author tried to code the people, but it wasn't in a particularly explicit way. And I feel like there's resistance, particularly from white people, to saying, you know, so-and-so is Black. Period, point blank. And there's nothing, and Black people don't take offense with being called Black because wait for it, that's what we are. Gay people don't get offended by being called gay unless they're closeted, and that's a whole other conversation. But like, it's okay to just say it. Okay, sorry, Will. Didn't mean to interrupt. I did, but sorry. Anyway.
No, it's okay. It kind of goes into, I guess, my point for, like, say, Gideon the Ninth. It's like they are afraid. They're afraid to just flat out call someone Black. Or sometimes they're afraid to call out someone who's queer because then they feel like, I don't know what they feel like because I don't have this problem. I don't. I also,
I do.
I don't. Like, I think we don't live in an age when people are like, well, you don't want to hit people over the head. Yes, you do. With certain things, yes, you do. And it's not about not trusting your reader. It's about allowing a gateway to be open, okay? Because we are still overall in reading and in storytelling here in the West coming from a white world of how we tell story, right? And the white tends to be the default a lot, right? That people think of. The next thing is second world naming. I really don't understand how people code things in, like, I guess I read Getting the Ninth, so like coding people brown or any other culture that isn't white. I don't really understand the coding. Why wouldn't you just say what it is and build your own world from there? You know, I find that really also very strange. Also, I wanted to piggyback off of what Gabe said about culturally, as someone who is legally the third, named after my father and his father, I'm actually the 24th. Because, you know, when they traveled over to the States, they had to change my last name, so it didn't count. So, yeah, I think in secondary worlds or like fantasy worlds, I feel like you can be a lot more inventive with how you have names, but also it doesn't need to be like Kavoth or Cabal or, you know, something hyphenated or like parentheses. Yes, Sameem.
This is touching on something Gabe had said earlier around like characters whose the first letter of their name is too similar or something like that. I think I understand that rule and where it's coming from, but at the same time, like if those are the characters' names and there's a good reason for it, I wouldn't stress about it that much, in my opinion. Especially because like I was always caught off guard by the fact that the villains in Lord of the Rings have like almost the same sounding names, like Saruman and Sauron, and I was like, if like that seems pretty basic. So I feel like stuff like that is stuff to worry about way later in like an editing process. Like if you're like, you know, about to be published and then have that conversation. Otherwise, just have fun with it.
Yeah, I mean, I have like an angle on this that I got not yelled by Will, but a little. I wrote a historical fantasy in an Aztec historical fantasy, and the names are long. In Nahuatl, the names are really long, like Quetzalcoatl, Popocatépetl, those Nezahualcóyotl, and I had all those names, and I got feedback from white people, like but the names are so complicated. You should consider making them shorter, so to not like scare your readers away. And I shared this feedback with my writing group, and Will was like, "Of course, the fuck you are. Like, leave those names in, or I will kick you." I mean, I had doubts. I mean, I was like, should I? But yeah, of course. I mean, I had the empowerment of Will, like, no, you definitely should not.
You should make them longer, if anything.
I just want to speak to that
Put their
point.
last names.
I want to speak to the point of what Gabe's saying, because I read the story, obvious. The names were long, but they were you could understand the differences in each of the names. Like, it wasn't hard. Okay, so for the people who said that, you know, make it shorter, basically they're idiots. Because if we can have long names for kingdoms and dragons and everything else that you see in the type of fantasy, then no, you don't need to shorten the names. They're going to have to learn to pronunciate it or make it up in your head for right now until you hear it on Audible.
My thing is like people can speak Elvish and Klingon. They can say and spell Daenerys Targaryen. Shut the fuck up. Like if this is bothering you, that is fine. Let it bother you. It's not like there aren't like random made up white people names that we don't have trouble with. No one knew how to say Daenerys until fucking Game of Thrones came out. So go off, sis. Like sound it out every time. Say it how you think you're supposed to say it. Anecdote. When I was a child reading comic books, I would read X-Men comic
Back in the
books.
day.
I'd never heard anyone say the word rogue. So I thought her name was Rogue U. But you know what? That's what happens when you're an industrious child reading before you know what the fuck the words sound like when they're spoken. So make up the way that you think it's pronounced until you hear the author fucking say it, then adjust. But like, you don't get to just like decide not to. I can't deal with this book because the names are just too hard. But you can say Daenerys. Fuck off.
Yeah, and you know what? I thought Rogue was actually Rouge because of like rouge makeup, and also I thought Themyscira was pronounced Themyscira. That's or Asgard was pronounced as like not Asgard. I used to think it was Asgard. That's what I used to say all the time. So there we go. Go ahead, Nick.
Asgard?
Yeah, yeah. That's what I used to think because like they had some like meaty men on there that had like their like their asses were like really sculpted, in the comic books, and I used to just look at them and be like, "Arr," break me off a piece of that. So
Somerville is still an ass man all these years later.
So,
yeah.
Nick, you had something to say? Or-
Yeah, I mean, this is a lovely conversation.
The ass threw him off.
It kind of did there. I'm kind of curious on everyone's thoughts and opinions on this, going back to what Gabe was giving as feedback for name pronunciations and things like that. How do we feel about a pronunciation guide or like a little index at the end to kind of help with the pronunciations? Like, I'll say this about Game of Thrones. I didn't struggle with most of the names. They're very Anglo friendly, if you will. But there's other books that I do struggle with. Suey Davies' book I struggled with, and I really wanted to get it named down. I know some things I struggle with, and it's weird. I know, Will. Will's giving me this look, and I just struggle with certain words because I'm afraid I'm actually pronouncing it wrong all the time. So being able to know like how I'm properly supposed to be pronouncing things does help out, especially when it's a culture I'm not familiar with. But how do we feel about pronunciation guides as like an index?
You know what? Before we get to that question, can we get to Sameem's question first, and then let's go around for that one. Go ahead, Sameem.
I think I can probably merge the two thoughts here. I think what I was going to say about the pronunciation is like, I think for people who are in the center of a culture, when they see something that they don't know how to pronounce, I think often it makes them feel stupid, and they don't want to have to feel stupid. Whereas for a lot of us who are coming from the margins, we're okay seeing things that are complicated and unfamiliar and just being like, well, I'm going to pronounce this as stupidly as I can in my head. And when I learn it better, that's fine, but I'm not going to let it stop me from sort of progressing and appreciating the story otherwise. And so I think that's a lot of what's usually going on there. In regards to like having a pronunciation guide or an index or something, I think like I personally wouldn't. I could see an argument for it either way. But I think it's extra work for me to have to do that, to be honest. And I will probably spell it out as like, as phonetically as possible, or as conventionally as possible. I tend to, if I use words that are not English in my stories, even names or not, I make them as Googleable as possible. So if somebody does want to know, they can do the work, and it's not the like a ton of research for them. So I would say, yeah, if you want to put pronunciation guides in, I don't think there's like I don't have like a moral objection to it, but I think I would have a moral objection to people demanding it, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Shingai?
I mean, Sameem summed it up pretty perfectly. Like, as someone who writes kind of bilingual stories, where there's always like a smattering of Swahili in my stories, and writing Englishes that aren't necessarily like European or American English, that are usually East African Englishes. I think that there is I think that is decentering English. Like, the work of doing that is decentering the expectation that everything will be understandable to the Anglophone audience. And it's also decentering that audience, which I think is really important for writers from the margins, like Sameem said. Yeah, and I think like if you want to add a glossary at the end, like that's a choice that you can make. But again, like Sameem said, it shouldn't be demanded or expected, especially from BIPOC and Global South writers.
Well,
I mean, a glossary for if you maybe had a secondary world, I can see that being like, okay. And from someone who's dyslexic, sometimes seeing the pronunciation guide and speaking it out loud helps me make sure that I don't reinverse the words. Because sometimes the biggest problem for me is I always reinverse words, especially when I'm writing. But when I'm reading, I've gotten a lot better at it. But sometimes when it's a secondary world, that's when I tend to have a problem if it doesn't come across rooted in a certain tradition. And I'm going to give an example. Speaking of Sui, which is weird, Nick, you brought him up. I was just texting with him last night.
He's
book,
amazing, by the way. If you guys haven't
yeah,
read
he's
Sui,
so great. We'll Sui Davies Okumbola. He what?
He came to Voodoonauts and was like a wonderful guest and instructor.
He's so smart and he's so like giving and he's just such a good person. But The Son of the Storm. I didn't need a pronunciation guide for The Son of the Storm, his first book in the Nameless trilogy, by the way, everyone. And I forget if he has one or not. I'll pull it from the shelves and later on I'll say it. But because I knew where it was rooted from, right? I knew where he was pulling that fantasy trilogy from. So I had an idea already in my head of like, oh, I'm going to like look this up as I'm reading and everything, right? I think that's really powerful. But say you're really unsure of where someone, or no one should be unsure, but let's just say it's like, even Brian McCallum, who wrote this one book that like I was like, what? I didn't understand what he was trying to say personally. And he's like this white dude from Utah, right, Nick? No, like I think he is from Utah. Yeah.
Brian McClellan from Utah. It's probably the Powder Mage series, which is a revolutionary.
Yeah, because I didn't understand. I didn't understand what his language was based in, right? Of some of the words that he was using. So there, I'm like, oh, maybe that would helpful. So for me personally, when I write in like say English and Spanish, no, I wouldn't put in a pronunciation guide because that's something you can easily Google. That's my thoughts on it. And I don't think it should have to be. I don't think anyone should have to do anything. I think all of our readers now, especially with technology, can work. I just like it for secondary worlds if I don't know where that system is being rooted in.
LP?
I'm going to pass.
Why not? You afraid it's controversial?
When have I ever been afraid of controversy?
Have you met LP?
That's
I'm
why I
burn
said
it down. If I didn't like the podcast, I'd be burning that down too. Yeah. No, it's just I think a lot of really smart things have been said. I just think that like it's a conversation about like when we make glossaries and pronunciation guides. I think we'll make some really great conversation about like as tools for accessibility, right? And then the other side of it is like, with people who are marginalized, whether that's like an ability marginalization, a race or ethnicity marginalization, like maybe a sexual minority. In my story, Wanderlust, when it got critiqued, I had people. I put the word verse in, VERS, and I got people being like, oh, I think this is a misspelling, or I think this is right? Because they don't know the context. And it's like, I can explain it, but I don't want to. or maybe it's not for you, or maybe you need to go and do some of the work yourself. So I think it's a conversation about what the author is comfortable with as far as like accessibility goes. Like in the case of Will, with like using them to better understand what it is that he's reading, or not mix up the words or reverse them. Or in the other situations, like, well, if you don't know what verse means in, you know, the top to bottom spectrum, I'm not going to explain it to you because Google is free. So I think it really depends on the author and who they've decided the audience is.
Yeah.
See, I wasn't going to say anything. Bitches.
I was going to say things, but basically everyone said everything. So yeah, let's move on to the next section about like creating the first pieces of your characters, which is after names. Matt talks about traits, and like how he talks about the importance of having like a notable physical trait in a character that can ground readers very quickly. He uses the examples of Captain Ahab and Gandalf. Like with just one thing, you can picture those characters. But and how these things can suggest a background, a backstory, the baggage they're carrying. I mean, Captain Ahab, definitely. Like there's things that there's a story behind those. But the thing that I would like to add in this is that he only talks about the physicality of the characters. And I think a very important thing that we all can add to ground readers is also how they use that physicality, if that makes sense. Like not just the trait, but how they move around the world, or a motor tick, a nervous tick, how fast they talk, how they look at things, how they take space, how they smile, they walk. Like there's so many things to ground readers. And I mean, just throwing this to the group, and maybe we'll talk for 30 minutes about this, about how do you create your character's physicality, and how much do you like being described in stories? Because I've read stories that it's just a couple things, and I don't have like a very clear image of that character. How much do you put in your own stories? How do you do it? And yeah, I mean, I'll just leave it there.
Okay, I'll go first. Speaking of physicality of characters, by the time this comes out, Brent's novella, A Necessary Chaos, will be out. And I have to say, Brent does this real, and I wish I could read an excerpt of what it is, but I can't yet. Both his characters in it have so much swag, but in such different ways. And it's the way that he is describing the way that they move. Just move. And he does it in such a way that gives you such like vibes, right? That is, to me, it's taught me a lot. And if you haven't read it, you need to go out and read it right away. The next thing is, interestingly enough, I had this challenge in my writing group to write a story where all of my characters aren't pretty. And I was like, going back through my things, I don't think I've ever described any of my characters as being overly beautiful. But my friend Billy, who's in me and Gabe's writing group, was like, I always picture your characters to be so beautiful. I don't know if it's because I am, or it's just because that's how like he's picturing it. So it's made me really think, like, how can I describe my characters with a little bit more nuance?
Yeah, and I mean, I would like to add for the question in general related to the conversation we had about names, like how much, depending on if it's secondary world or primary world, as LP said, like how much do you ground the reader in how the characters look? Like how much, like how intentional are you so that readers don't, like it's very clear what kind of person you are portraying. So LP?
Yeah. So my first and zero draft are generally like me spitting the story out and figuring out what it is. My second draft is usually me creating physical space and also spending time describing characters. But one of the things that I use is the only other person I've heard using it. I haven't forgotten their name. I just don't want to fuck it up on a podcast. Esquiri Liu. where they have a Twitter thread where they describe the experience of essentially meditating and physically embodying the character so that they can move through the world as this person. And that helps them build their descriptions as well as how they interact with the world, as well as the people that they interact with the world while in character. So it's kind of like an improvisation and acting. I guess it's more improvisation, but using it for prose. But I feel like that's a later stage thing than like, oh, I've decided that so-and-so has red hair and freckles and like, whatever. Because I think those things they're good to start with, but just so I, as a writer, can come back to this like, oh, what does this bitch look like? But later on, I do the embodiment exercises instead.
Mm-hmm. That sounds so cool. Now, Sameem.
Yeah, I was gonna say something similar. I think I come to it much later usually. I think I'm always much more focused on the sort of identifiable personality traits and the way that they interact with the world, like mentally and less physically. And it's something that I have to challenge myself with more to describe the way that things are physically and fill in the blanks. But I usually sort of like push through the story in internal dialogue and dialogue, and then go back later on to fill in the blanks of, oh yeah, this is what the world actually looks like, and this is identifiable characteristics of people. So I find it challenging, and I think I try to do a similar exercise to what LP was mentioning, like really trying to like sit down and embody the character and imagine how they are flowing through the world and what they must see when they like look in the mirror and at other people and whatnot.
Yeah. So, Shingai?
I think such good points have been made. I think one of the things that I've been thinking about is like bodies. Bodies are also political. Sorry for always bringing it back to this, but like genuinely, even in my novel, I was thinking about disability, for example, and one of the stories or books that I really appreciate how it was done was Bitter by Akwaeke Emezi. Just because there is a moment where a disabled character has the opportunity to heal and they choose not to. And like that, like I can't do the part justice, but it's like, it's this emphasis on like, I am a whole human being as I am. And I think that that's so deeply important. However your character looks, because of the way certain bodies in real life have been validated more than other bodies. And this applies also to like, fat versus thin bodies and like white versus black bodies and like all these different ways that our bodies move through the world and how the way that they are perceived is tied to our value, quote unquote, and how do you subvert those things in the descriptions of the characters that you were writing is something that I think about a lot.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is a good segue to the next part in this conversation about creating characters. And I mean, the way that Matt goes about this is like in the mechanics of it. To figure out your character is this adage of just write a scene of their day to day, how they go to work, how they go to school, how they interact with their friends. Even if those scenes don't end up in your story, like he talks about how that's a good way to flesh them out, to figure them out. And I think this is a really good point that I've heard Fonda Lee say on several occasions of how creating a character in isolation like really doesn't work. You need the context of the character. And that context can be, I mean, their own, Shingai was talking about, like their own physicality, how that physicality relates to their context. Because depending on where you are, how the state of your body, of your mind, will make you move through the world in a different way. So the in this part is like, how do you guys, like, how much do you work the world out, the context out, before fleshing out your characters, or are those things like intertwined in your stories? Because I mean, you have the three legs of story. It's world, character, and the plot. But I honestly think that the thing, I mean, this is my own perception, that character and world and like the setting and context are the things that if you work them together are the ones that are going to make it easier for you to create a good, deep character. And LP?
Yeah, I mean, so this is going to sound a little wild, but I feel like I come to character last, not because I don't think character is valuable, but like I said before, the novum is do you know what I mean when I say novum? It's the speculative conceit, right? It's the little bit of speculative. When we went to ICFA, Isaiah Lavender III described the novum as like a speculative thing in the story, and then the way, because it was that particular thing was Afrofuturism. So the novum is what the world interacts with, and then the second part was like how Black people interact with the novum in this world, right? So whatever the speculative conceit is, I kind of like extrapolate that as far as I can. Then I start thinking about like, okay, what does that look like interacting with the person who would be the most interesting person to interact with it? And then I start to come up with the character. But I usually discover the character during the drafting process and then refine the character by the second draft, and then things start to make sense. But like, for me, characters are products of the world versus being like the first thing that I dream up. Does that make sense?
I mean, that makes sense, as we all are. Like, we literally are all products of our context. Like, that's how the world works, basically. So
thank you for affirming me.
You're very welcome. Sameem?
I think I come to plot last. I think world is definitely first. I definitely am aligned there that like you can't really have the character without the world because we are products of it, unfortunately, for better or for worse. But I don't think I can have a plot until I understand where the characters are and what they're trying to do, how they're trying to survive, what their struggles are, and then it sort of comes together. But that said, I think like once I feel like there's world and plot, or sorry, there's world and character. But then once the plot comes in, they sort of like swirl all together and start pushing back on each other. And so there's definitely like a lot of interaction back and forth between the three that evolve each other as things go on.
Yeah. Well,
everything is character and plot are intertwined for me. The world, I find out about it through the characters. And this thing of, it's interesting to me when people are like, I need to know the history of the world, or I need to build up the world first. I have never found that to be true for myself, because I think history and knowledge of the world is ever expanding, specifically the way that even the United States views history, of what they think it is and what it actually was, especially in these discussions of critical race theory, indigenous people. You know, when we hear the words that Columbus discovered America, he didn't discover it. He just landed on it. It was already discovered by the people who lived here. So that's why I try to go about my world building through the eyes of the characters and through the plot that's being delivered in the book. So I don't ever think of the world unless it's through my character's eyes. I don't need to figure that out. The characters are going to inform me, and there's going to be conflicting versions of the world by those different characters.
Yeah, I mean, it's like this story, or whatever that's called, of blind people looking, quote unquote, at an elephant, and how one is touching the leg, and what is this? And one is like, oh, this is like a tree, and the other one is touching the trunk, and they're like, oh, it's like a snake, and the other one is touching another part. So, I mean, yeah, definitely the way, and Matt talks about this, like the best way to do double duty with your characters is to show the world through their lens, because you're showing character there and you're showing a piece of your world. But I think I disagree with Will a bit, in the sense that not disagree, it's just different methods, that I need to have like a superficial understanding of the world, at least, to be able to see how much that colors my characters. And then it feeds off, like it becomes like a virtuous cycle of, Because if you really, I'm thinking a ton, I've mentioned it so many times, about Greenbone Saga. One of the main characters, Hilo, you know what the hell he's gonna do every single time. Not only because we understand his character so well, but we understand the context. We understand the system, and we're like, okay, he's placed in this situation, he's gonna do this. But because we understand the setting, we understand the world. But I mean, this is obviously not a thing you can figure out in your first draft wholly. So yeah.
Yeah, but let's think of it this way too. Let's give something like, let's think of Star Wars for a minute. Luke just wanted to get off of Tatooine and like live his life. Leia wanted to change the world and had a more nuanced look at the way things are. Don't you Star Wars me. It's just, I'm using it as a grounding technique, LP. Leia had a much more nuanced look of like, there is going to be no finding ourselves in the universe if we don't destroy it and we don't make changes from this horrible empire. You know, Luke didn't necessarily feel like the empire was evil to a certain extent in the beginning of Star Wars. So that's where I'm saying that my characters are coloring how I view the world. So I don't think we're disagreeing. I think we just have different methods about how how we go about the world initially.
Mm-hmm. Nick?
All right, I got a fun exercise for you guys. I feel like this is going to kind of tell us a little bit of different about how we approach things, right? When you go to travel to a new place, do you do research before you get there, or you get there and just explore it? And I feel like that is the difference in what a lot of us are saying right now, right? Are we going to take our character and just go explore the world, or are we going to go ahead and get a foundation in the world and where we're going and what we're going to do first before we even get there? I feel like that's kind of like the two conversations that are happening right now. Are we researchers or explorers right now? And it's really fun because I'm an explorer. As I said earlier in this show, like I have to be with my character and I have to go do things, and I have to learn how to see it from their point of view and not just mine. So I'm not bleeding myself too far into the page, right? Because we want to write characters that are distinct from ourselves and different points of views and lenses.
Oof, that's such a good exercise. Shingai, tell us.
I'm going to pass it to Sameem.
I'll be quick. My answer is both. And I think it depends on, like in real life, it depends on where I'm going. And I think it's the same in the story. And it can be, for different parts of the story, it can be like, I'm going to plan and know exactly where this is happening and how beforehand. And other parts, it's going to be like, I'm going to throw this character in and let them wander around or let them have this conversation with this person and see where it goes so I can learn through the character, like Will was saying. So I think both are really useful tools, and it just depends on the situation or your mood, to be honest. Like whatever is going to get you to write that day can also be part of it.
Yeah. I mean, I'm thinking that this could also be like a literal thing you make your characters do. Like, how would they comport themselves traveling? Because, I mean, when you traveled, like, the more different the place is from where you live, like, the more, I believe, your personality shows. Like, your strengths and weaknesses, like, show when you're traveling far. Like, how you treat people, servers, how you ask for directions, how do you solve problems. Like, now I'm just itching to have my characters travel to a very different city or a different place to see how they behave. Oh, there's so much about character, so much that we didn't touch on that I had in my notes. I mean, one of the things, honestly, I had this like an ending note of how, like, at least for me, the more I know my characters, the more I work on my characters, the easier the rest of my process is, because I can figure out the easiest where the conflict is, how can I show the world, the relationships, like all those things. And I think, honestly, again, the more you work on your characters, the easier it is to write the rest of the things. But also, I would like encourage people to create such good characters that you give an easier time for fanfic writers to use your world. Because, I mean, the better your character is, the more people are going to want to write them out, to use them for their own fan fiction. And I think that is, I mean, it is one of the highest, oh, damn it, I lost the phrase. The highest
Forms of
praise.
flattery.
Yeah, the highest form of flattery. And just make it easy for fanfic writers. Work on your characters. Put the work in. Put the, as we say in Mexico, put those as hours in your characters. And the rest of the things will be easier. At least that's my advice.
That's such good advice. Yeah. Write characters that other people want to build off of.
With permission.
With permission.
Yeah.
And this has been Just Keep Writing, a podcast for writers, by writers, to keep you writing. You can find us at justkeepwriting.org. Follow us on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and YouTube. Feel free to reach out to any of us on our social medias, and please jump in our Just Keep Writing Discord channel. Links to all of that is in the show notes. Lastly, please support our show by going to patreon.com/justkeepwriting. We offer daily writing prompts, early access to podcast episodes, and much more. Thanks for listening, and just keep writing.